Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1054, and I will today discuss the different modes of thinking. And thanks to a parallel movement, this is especially something caused starting from yesterday, looking at the text of Tartang and cross-paralleling them as Edward de Bono suggested. May he rest in peace, the genius. I come to an understanding of modal thinking or modes in thinking, and I'm pretty sure that understanding would not have come if that cross-hatching hadn't sort of sprung into action. I would say that was an absolute necessity. I realized they take a grave difference in thinking to, it's hard to explain. It's like, as Heidegger would imply, you never get out of the metaphysics of presence. And looking at things from different aspects and doing that in a short time period can actually cause a movement in the mode of thinking, not only the content of the thinking, but the mode of the thinking. We usually see thinking only as content, that my thinking corresponds to something, could be an action, could be something in the world, and my thinking is that content. And somehow I could go back and see, where did I go wrong? What did I think that was wrong that caused this problem or something similar? And I can sort of say, oh, I made a mistake there. I need to correct that. That part of the thinking was wrong somehow. Although I still think that is part of what is happening, that is not the whole thing. And it took me by surprise to realizing that. That was an unexpected bonus. And that understanding is in itself a different mode. That I realize now. It is a sharp difference in mode, indeed. And it causes a thinking that can still understand what I was thinking before, sort of inhabit that, but now it's also something definitely much broader and more encompassing. Give me a second here. Sorry about that. I really would like to know if one could pause by a remote control. I have a remote control, but that one just lets me stop and start, and that is not really the same thing. Pause would have been excellent. Otherwise, one need to go into some YouTube lab and sort of fix them together, which is strenuous and cumbersome. Well, so any suggestions, you're more than welcome to let me know. I'll be very happy for that. Well, modus is, I think, maybe the hardest thing to understand when it comes to Heidegger, and that he's not looking for a change in content, but he's looking for a change in modus. And that means actually that the content can be exactly the same. And that is the why question. That is the amnesia that is going to a very definite before. Of course, the content could be different in the other mode, but you will soon understand that mode is the more important, the more so 1054. With a special modus comes a special thinking. That thinking will have all the traits of what it presents. Within it will be all sides of representations, all aspects of representations, all levels of representations. And they would be transponded on each other, layer upon layer, and one will not block another one out. And that is what happened in level 2 of the modus. There is no blockage. You don't have to choose between one and the other. You can have both. So it's a broader, more encompassing thinking. And now we come to the reason for something that we've known for a long time in this series, and that is that psychotherapy doesn't work. The scientific indications are pretty clear that nothing ever happens. There's no change in demeanor, poise, directionality, tonality in the patient. That never happens. And now we understand the reason is because the psychotherapist is addressing the content of the patient. And he has no means to access what is important, that is the modus. One can clearly think that the patient is of a lower modus, and that is the trouble. So that will mean, speaking now our modus, that the understanding is lower. Understanding is not a separate part of a human being. So you have understanding, and then you have all the rest, like emotions, feelings, wants, needs, rationality, intellectualization, and so forth. And then on the side you have understanding. That is nonsensical, and I think we put that clear. But that realization together with modus make for a powerful mixture. And this powerful mixture shows that the patient's understanding is what is the problem. And speaking to the patient will not change that. It will reinforce that understanding. It is not part of the equation, according to the psychoanalysis or the psychiatrist or the psychologist, what understanding is. It is just assumed to be same somehow, or not even assumed. It's taken for granted. You can see the parallel here by having a world out there and the idea that understanding is not something that could be put into question. It just is there somehow. Never hypothesized, never thought of, never seen as being different from person to person during the day, how the modus changes. You see how this forgetfulness, although it seems so meek and non-powerful, is extraordinarily powerful. It's much more powerful than all other philosophies put together. It's an incredible thing, so to speak. Modality is something that can be used to other and each purpose, and modality is definitely what Heidegger and Derrida sinks into and uses. They have an intuitive understanding for it. And this is of course also the thing that almost completely defy understanding, and that is how do we reach modal thinking? How can we turn our thinking into something greater, some more encompassing? And how can we understand Heidegger and Derrida? Well, modus is the way, because modus is also the why question. In the modality, I would call that level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is the ordinary after the why question, when we can only submit to where, when, and so forth. We have no access to the why question, and therefore it's a lot less level of energy. We positively know less, understand less. Exclusion subsides in level 1. The understanding itself, take the patient's mind, the understanding is the modus that should be addressed. And it's not addressed, it's sort of randomly passed over, not addressed. You could say, simplification, that the patient's understanding is sick, but that's a bit of a simplification. And attacking the patient with questions, trying to make investigations of the patient, it will not make a difference. Nothing will come out of that. Nothing will actually happen. You will just reinforce the old level thinking, the way of exclusion, because meaning making in level 1 is something that has to do with polarity, polar knowledge, as we mentioned. So all understanding is polar. It's understood in the way the truth is what is not false. So truth cannot stand by itself. It is always in comparison to something else. It doesn't have its own power, and therefore it will be constantly, as Derrida says, deferred. It will not be present. It will constantly be under the pressure of deferral and difference. It will always be different to itself. And you can hear this makes a hard job to coping with understanding something. And the understanding is bound to be much less. The polar understanding of the patient, that is probably more polar than the psychoanalyst or the psychologist or the psychiatrist, will not be furthered by implying more understanding. It could even be the case the psychologist's understanding is less polar, but in the ears of the patient it becomes immediately polarized knowledge, because that's the way of understanding at level 1. So all the talking is bound to arouse more polar knowledge and greater lack of understanding, of deeper understanding, of true understanding, where the terms, what you say, stand by themselves. They're not constantly differing or differing. They are simply there for the grab or for the understanding. And another example is, of course, complementarity. From a level 1, that cannot be understood. And that is the reason the project of Gary Zukov, of Fritjof Capra, and many others to understand quantum mechanics has failed. For them, it is just on level 1, 1 plus 1. And I would say that goes with most non-dual thinking. I think one of the few people that actually tackled it hard is Graham Priest, for necessary reason. He is in that world, so to speak, so he had to understand it, and that understanding must have been level 2, not level 1. I met Gary Zukov myself, and the little understanding I had from quantum mechanics was even smaller in his. It was just a new type of rationality somehow, a level 1 take on everything that was in some way more exotic or fun. Can sound like an unjust comment on Gary Zukov, but read his books. It doesn't seem that he's trying not to make sense, he's trying to make sense. And then he would be in the same situation as the psychiatrist or the psychoanalyst who's trying to make sense for the patient, and thereby sort of conferring good material so the patient can understand. I would say that cannot happen. That is not a possibility that is open. Sorry again for this. But we can go beyond level 1 by deconstruction. And according to Rolf Gachet, the mirror image, or the plane of the mirror, is the way to make a first leap to this greater and more encompassing understanding. We go beyond the modus of just level 1 polar understanding knowledge. We will go beyond and encompass both, and still let both be completely oppositional. And that will be helped by deconstruction. I would say that the start of the meaning crisis come from level 1 being more and more reinforced for every time. Everything is level 1, and all attempts of sort of questioning its supervenience, dominance, will always reinforce it, because a polar knowledge attack on something that is polar knowledge attack will still be polar. That goes into the project, so to speak. That is the meaning crisis. That is also the problem of modernity. We have a escalating polar knowledge tendency, and the first thing to do is to understand that thinking itself is important. Not the content of the thinking, but the directionality, the force of the thinking. And I think you might remember the previous lectures we had about Frederick Matthias Alexander, the inventor or constructor of the Alexander technique. He always wrote that thinking needs to be pointed, active, and directed. And I think now that that was another mode of thinking. Simply repeating in level 1 won't work, because that thinking is too weak to cause an effect in the bodily system. It doesn't have that power, doesn't have that grip on things. It is more repetition than iteration, and I talked earlier that iteration is the thing that brings stability, where every new thing is not exactly 100% the same, whereas repetition builds weakness, it becomes less, and repetition also paves the way for polar knowledge, polar understanding. And I think those differences are incredibly important to point to, because they are a pathway of getting into modus. Definite pathway of modus. Standards, values, and meanings, they get nullified on level 1, because the law of the contradiction will take its toll. One is dependent on the other, and it uses up its own energy and nothing is left. That is nullification. That is leaving nothing for understanding. It is not in itself. It is what it is because of the other. And that makes truth become incredibly dependent on falsehood. That will erode, as I mentioned before, will actually erode what is true and what is false as well. This is very similar to the voice of the friend, that the voice of the friend can only speak plurality by not excluding singularity, and vice versa. A voice that preemptively tries to exclude singularity or plurality cannot express neither. Everything that you can find in level 1 is also in level 2, nothing excluded. It is a greater take. And my way of making a simile of that is thinking about the Klein bottle, or why not the Necke cube. And in level 1 there is just one side, whereas in level 2 you have both sides at the same time. You see the two directions or possibilities of understanding the Necke cube simultaneously, without needing to exclude anyone. Whereas the normal take of the Necke cube is that it's either or, and that is constantly shifting. And we are at level 1 constantly shifting. We don't have a definite direction. It is change of posture all the time. There is no poise. There is no being togetherness with yourself. And your life is seen as something you just watch. You are a bystander to your own lived reality. Because this is how the modus of polar knowledge works. It is its working mode. One way of looking at this, and I hope at least Kalle Lundahl here has been looking at the debates between Jacques Derrida and John Searle. And it's obvious once you start watching, you see that John Searle has much less options than Jacques Derrida. He seemed less confident, he is less lucid, he's unclear, and he models everything with this polarity. But what he has to do on his level is to put a stance, and that stance is always limited already before by what it's not. It's always taking polarity as its starting point, and that will make his thinking smaller. So correctness will not be something that will come into his thinking. His modus will be low, so correctness cannot enter, and therefore he will be forced to put himself into a position, into a posture, so to speak, a postural attitude at the lower level. So you're stuck, and then you will be that passive mood there. You don't project energy, you don't have a pre-made world, and then when you haven't projected, you will instead grasp for what's there. And he's grasping in the debates after what Derrida is saying. But Derrida is constantly, according to John Searle, slipping away. But Derrida is clearly on another level. He can see the Necker cube from two directions at the same time, and he can see openings in the exact wording of John Searle. So John Searle is not able to lock everything. So his project, Limited Incorporated, doesn't lock up properly. It leaves openness. So Derrida can constantly change within the text of John Searle. This is where the debate takes place, in the text of John Searle himself. Something that I would be very grateful for if I were to be John Searle, but he is not, because he gets stressed out what Derrida is doing, and he can't understand what he's doing. But it's the trial to centrism in John Searle's own text shows that it falls apart, or it nullifies itself. And Derrida points to contradictions in the text, elegantly so, and Derrida has a whole register of mirror images that he can play on, whereas John Searle needs to stick to only one, wants to stick to only one, and thereby putting a posture which is literal, literally posturize, whereas Derrida has the poise. And he inhabits the text of John Searle. Easy, leisurely, happily, he enjoys himself. Whereas John Searle obviously doesn't enjoy himself, not all the time anyway. He's offended, he's coarse, he becomes half aggressive. According to John Searle himself, Derrida is not playing by the rules, but Derrida is constantly showing that the rules that John Searle puts up contradicts themselves, with no need for Derrida to enter to point that out, actually. So he juxtaposes the texts and see that there is a change in the text, and a change in the text is a lack of directionality, because meaning, true meaning, can only be had at level 2. And that is where truth stands for itself, when you have a true direction going up, not starting from comparing to something else, which is quite different, very far from being the same thing. And I come to think about flatlanders. We discussed that many lectures ago, last summer I think it was. How flatlanders cannot understand how three-dimensional human beings walk in their flat land. That is beyond their two-dimensional understanding, because of course their understanding will be two-dimensional as well. So for them, a moving three-dimensional creature is a mystery. It's nothing about miraculous. It's something that appears and then it disappears and then it appears once we're walking in the flatland. The three-dimensionality of this human being is level 2. That means it can understand all that is in 2-dimension, or what the 2-dimensionists, the flatlanders, are doing, thinking, working for, and it can also understand so much more. It's more encompassing, it's broader, it's more relaxed too, because it's a poise, it's not a pre-established posture. Because we do posturize today. We have this pre-take on reality, and it becomes stiffer and stiffer as we age. It's softer in the morning, it's harder in the evening. All those things apply. Having more access in the level 2 will also imply more energy, more precision, and more generality. Why is that? Well, it is because when we access level 2, we have all the aspects of the Necker cube or the Klein bottle at the same time. And that applies both to time, space, and knowledge. And that is an accumulation, becomes more. This is why I say that modus is not qualitatively different. It is quantitatively different. Because everything that is on level 1 will be encompassed in level 2. Everything that was on the understanding of John Searle is encompassed in the book Limited Incorporated by Jacques Derrida. And this is the working of the Klein bottle, where space in a way is endless, but it can be made not endless by inhabiting it, by localizing yourself within it. And that has to be your own free choice, not made up by a coordinate system preemptively statue-like, but like a poise, balanced, relaxed, taking in the surroundings, which doesn't mean that you disappear. No, quite the opposite. You come into life, you come into existence, you get your substantiality that way. And the reason why we don't reach that is because in level 1 that's contradictory. The very foundation of our understanding is not built that. Our understanding itself, our way of understanding something, is in itself this polar knowledge, which makes it from the beginning understand everything as polar things. This moreness, this quantity that is greater in level 2, it's the same as prana, ki, chi, or those other terms that so unhappily has been transcribed as energy. There can be no understanding on prana, ki, or the snake, the cobra, without coming up into level 2, because it's a quantitative difference and it has an absolute measure. Beyond or below a certain level, that understanding is simply not there. This is what I mean with quantity. Almost measurable level. Above that level, you leave polar knowing, and all of a sudden what you say speaks for itself. No need to compare. No need any longer to put one side next to, juxtaposit something to have some meaning coming out, some derived meaning. That is not a possibility in level 1. Cannot be. Then you have to go to level 2, and then there is a difference in understanding, and there is more of everything. And that moreness, as I call it, it's absolute in some way. Not compared to something else, but in itself. Almost like a fractal that's fractal enough will be stable. That's just how it is. Doesn't have to be with comparison to anything else. It is by itself stable. And so should we be when we are poised. Not stable because we tense our knees or backs or anything like that, or that we bend, or that we lie, or that we squiggle, or something like that. We stand true. We are truly balanced in ourselves. We need not to rest on something. The posture has become fractal enough to bear itself. That would be hard in the beginning, but once it becomes easier and easier, when you're approaching that limit, when it stands by itself, it would be easier and easier, and in the end, you would stand by yourself. You'd be completely balanced, and that would be a much healthier way of being. Then you can cope with everything. And what is helpful here is, of course, to understand that there's absolutely no loss. What level 2 is no loss. If you want to give a description to level 2, it's no loss. It's how it works is by no loss. Because there is a loss of having either or together. 1 and 2, 1 and 1. Wave and particle. Or wave and or particle. No, take it all, and then you have moreness, and then you have this prana, because that in itself is a directionality, and you never felt that directionality. Therefore, all translations of prana are, so to speak, useless, because they address the level 1 language, and there no understanding can be had, ever. And by translating, you make the problem even worse. You sort of enlarge the idea, make it stronger, even stronger, that the world is out there, a world at large, and that you can only represent it in your head. And it's not even you who exists, it's someone else or something else. Translations of prana have been made so many, and we are currently in a yoga class or yoga study. It will not be made, and this is of course the reason why constantly in Ashtanga, the eightfold yoga, niyama, yama, and also dharani are left to the side, because they cannot be understood from level 1. They don't make any sense whatsoever, so why include them? Well, you should include them still, I think, but I do understand why they're not included. But they should still be included because they are vastly important. And the very idea that yoga, asanas, dhyana, which is concentration or meditation, will still happen is simply nonsensical. It's like saying, for some mad reason, Ashtanga has 8 arms. What we should not touch the first 3 arms, because there is a sequential thing there. You start with a yama, niyama, and so forth. But that is completely ignored for, I would say, practical reasons. They don't make any sense and they confuse us. But they're still absolutely necessary. That would not make them unnecessary. Here I have another article from Scribd, it's also by Toku, that could give some more hints towards this. It's called Body of Time. An intimacy of present contact experience speaks of inspiration. A movement of the spirit activates direct knowledge, giving the given and granting what we take for granted. As time unfolds across past and present and future, this originating inspiration takes on content and significance. The creative search of what we embrace in the present is the outcome of a momentum that gathers towards specificity. Past and future intervene in present, giving momentum expression. I think that momentum is what prana is. This is the kundalini awoken. Inspiration is without distinction, making all seem possible. Yet experience of all that is possible does not appear all at once. Nor does the present harbor all possibilities as actual. Qualities and characteristics measure out experience, allowing description and comparison. They enable us to present the present to our knowing, yet these most vital aspects of experience seem to have their source not in the present, but in the past. And future. Perhaps the future gives the present form, allowing it to emerge, while the past gives it substance, like an object casting its shadow. Together, past and future filter the range of all possible events, shaping the indeterminate impact of inspiration into the actual. The present comes to be as what has emerged from a specific past and continues toward a specific future. The source of what is lies in what we understand to have been and expect to be. These determining attributes of past and future coexist with the unknowability of past and future as such. Though time flows constantly from one to the other, past and present and future seem like three independent domains or fields. Perhaps, however, what appears disconnected on the surface is linked underneath, like the caps of waves on the ocean. If so, a unifying body of time would account for the appearance of the three times. So it's these determining attributes can also be seen as fields. Though time flows constantly from one to the other, past and present and future seem like three independent domains or fields. Perhaps, however, what appears disconnected on the surface is linked underneath, like the caps of waves on the ocean. If so, an unifying body of time would account for the appearance of the three times. Is there a way to explore whether this might be so? To investigate the interconnections among the three times. One approach might be to describe the three times as gone, becoming, and not yet. But these designations do not tell us very much about the nature of time. How does present shift to past? How does future open into present? Is the movement sudden or gradual? Are there clear boundaries, borders and transitions? Suppose that we pushed past and future to their furthest limits, the beginning of the beginning and the end of the end, in the sense that these two extremes are unknowable, they are identical. We might speculate that this identity extends further, that their extremes past and future meet, like I can see like a trajectory going in parallel. In the end they meet at the horizon, typical in painting. Is there a way to prove or disprove this hypothesis? Taking a third approach, we could focus on a difference between the present on the one hand and the past and future on the other. The present in its immediate intimacy could be understood as the direct presence of space. The past and future, however, cannot be found within space. They stand outside the gate of being. But what exactly does this mean? What distinctive qualities do the past and future have that set them apart from the present and from each other? The qualities of past and future can in some sense be experienced, even if these times are not directly accessible. Each field of time has its own impact on awareness, and the degree of impact changes constantly in accord with our participation. Someone with natural sensitivity or meditative training, or someone caught up in an intense experience, may be able to challenge the parameters of such participation, opening alternatives. How do awareness and the senses gather together in past or future? Are they sharp and vivid, clear and effective, or are they fuzzy, dull and dreamy? Can we restore the immediacy of the present to memories that have passed, or bring that immediacy to what has not yet arrived? Could close investigation or experiential exercises open past and future to being? Can we lead awareness to this point? What do we know of the relationship between our awareness and time? The structure of our mental faculties leads us to impose on time a particular order or design. We view time as being one-dimensional, like a rope stretched taut between an imagined point of origin and another similar point of termination. In one sense, we locate ourselves at some point along this rope or line, which we designate as the present. In another sense, this location is really no location at all, for the present is simply where we are located. Invariably, all the past is behind us and all the future is ahead of us. In the occupying this non-located present, we are cut off from the flow of time. An indication of this being cut off is our limited ability to contact what happens in time. In occupying this non-located present, we are cut off from the flow of time. An indication of this being cut off is our limited ability to contact what happens in time. The past is available through being stored in memory, the future through inference. Neither tool is very reliable or accurate. They represent only incompletely the countless transitions that time presents. The limits that time presents form the truth of our existence. Our existence is time, like in being and time. And to understand the time side must come together with being for an understanding to be complementary. They are both needed. Not just one is needed, both of them are needed. The limits that time presents form the truth of our existence. Although we claim to have time, our claim of ownership rings hollow. We are always rushing, always short of time, and if the rushing stops, we are left feeling empty and without purpose. Emotionality and confusion eat up the little time we have. If maturity brings a deeper understanding, it may well come too late. These limits may not be natural to time at all. If the whole of space, immeasurable both in scope and content, is encompassed within this very moment in time, these limits may be imposed on time from outside. Within the vastness of space, what is known to our awareness is the sharply limited aspect of knowledge as a whole, like a narrowly focused beam of light that leaves the surrounding darkness intact. If the reach of space and the range of knowledge are so vast, can time really be restricted? Three times. Passage of time. When we walk from here to there, it takes time to do so. We know how much time by reference to other events that also takes place in time, such as the movement of the hands of the clock. Such time measured in this way is objective. We consider it almost absolute, but in fact such a measure is meaningful only because it's related to other events that concerns us. For example, the span of the day is marked out by the passage of the sun across the sky, light giving way to darkness. There is the time between one breath and the next, or the time between one stage of life and the next. So you see, this is like polar time almost, a time that takes comparison to be. Looking at the clock is actually a comparison between yourself and the time. And that's very hard to pinpoint to that because everything happens so quick you will not even think about it. And this is the forgetfulness from a temporal aspect. And what is the forgetfulness in the temporal aspect? Well, is this hastened tendency, the speed, the stress, the N2 neurons. In measuring the difference between the blink of an eye and a billion years, the point of reference is human experience, indissoluble, linked to the physical realm and to embodiment. Time in a non-physical realm might be very different, since experience and the basis for measurement would be inconceivably different. Time, as it existed before human beings appeared, is also a matter for speculation. Our way of measuring assimilates that time to our own, positioning our time on the continuum with all time, but without human beings to provide a basis for measurement, earlier time might well have been quite different from our own. We tend to believe that the presence or absence of human beings would not affect the flow of time, which remains uniform and objective. But this assertion is based only on our conviction regarding time. The knowing we call on to witness time's uniformity arises within the framework of time. It is inside. Presented in time, knowledge accords with the possibility that time presents. Our usual picture presents time as unfolding along a horizontal line drawn from past toward future. If we think of this line as representing the history of the universe, a point near the beginning would represent a time when the universe was younger than at present. Furthermore, an object that came into being at that point would be older than something created at the moment closer to the present. This model could easily be replaced by others. We might look at time as unfolding vertically instead of horizontally, or in layers or cycles, or even through oscillations in place. But each of these models would maintain the key element of continuity and flow that allow us to speak of older and more recent. And to understand what is closer or more distance in time in terms of a ratio. Based on continuity, we understand that the progression from event to event, as we would understand the flickering of a candle flame variations in one steady event. It is helpful to see that in such an understanding there is no basis in time itself for distinguishing past from present and future, no distinctive disconnection. Instead, if there were a disconnection, what had been disconnected would have to be rejoined for the flow of time as we experience it to proceed. Who would be the joiner, and when would the joining take place? The passage of time would not make sense unless time exhibited continuity. The senses report a continuous unfolding of events. And the mind moves in its own continuity of thought and perception. As we walk from this place to that, we may be daydreaming and unaware of what is happening. Still, we are certain that time continues to unfold. The continuity we experience and accept is linked to the basic sense that we are here. In space and time, for the specific territories of experience are carved out by a fundamental rhythm that stimulates, situates, and positions. Whatever distinctions we maintain, specific dynamics and mechanics determine an underlying structural unity. Past, present, and future share the temporal order. Points located in space share locatedness. The knowledge that knows shares a particular body of knowledge based on the time and space available. Each point, whether understood in terms of time or space or knowledge, is viewed in multiple dimensions that express a whole. This is one reason it's so difficult to conceive of a time before the universe came into existence, or when the universe no longer exists. Such discontinuities are not tolerated. Continuity is likewise bound to the experience of the self. My perception, thought, awareness, and memories form part of a lineage based on the private domain of the self. If my mental activities were not separate from other people's, it is difficult to know whether we could even be aware of the passage of time as continuous. The actual experience of the self, however, suggests that continuity itself is not continuous. Instead, continuity depends on the mechanism of repetition and derivation. The separation of time into past, present, and future is one indication that continuity must be referred to such underlying mechanisms. The present arises in terms of a from and a to that trace to past and future. In the same way, each of the three times supports the others. Without this structure, could continuity manifest? Experience itself might be considered another such mechanism, a way in which time can present itself as ready to be recorded and measured, so that distinctions and comparison can be made, establishing connections that assure the continuity of continuity. Perhaps the existence of the self is a fundamental mechanism for continuity as well. So a little bit here we see that in the level 1 type of time, time doesn't speak for itself. It's always a comparison. And therefore it is a lower take on time. And the higher level 2 time encompasses that time, because that takes place in time, making a comparison. Still we can do it, we can use it, but there is a higher level at the same time. And this is the non-exclusion of complementarity that works on time as well. And I think the trick, the key to understanding Heidegger is that the title of the book is twofold. It is time and being. Important to understand. Being and time and being, they are both there, and I will say they are the two keys that can make the lock open, and they need to be put in simultaneously, almost like those expensive bank safes that needs to be opened by two people that switches two different keys at the very same time. Lack of simultaneity will not open the door. That means you can't do it by yourself because they are too far apart. I think that's an ingenious, actually an invention that is more than 100 years old. Looking directly at such mechanisms, rather than the content they provide for, we see the momentum of from and to at work. One point moves toward all points. A rapid rhythm expresses the dynamic of continuity and unity in the form of patterns that generate a characteristic friction. Appearance arise the product of a field transformation. The basic mechanisms are confirmed in such a way that their operation is never in question, and the world makes itself available for the measurement and specification. Provided these basic mechanisms continue in operation, even a completely non-standard experience, for example an experience of timelessness, will not ultimately disrupt the unity and the continuity of our being here in space and time. Provided these basic mechanisms continue in operation even at a completely non-standard experience, for example the experience of timelessness, will not ultimately disrupt the unity and continuity of our being here in space and time. But if the mechanisms did not function, or if they were not given the same authority, would continuity cease to exist? Could events arise that were discontinuous, that had no place within the temporal order? Our ability to imagine the unfolding of time is restricted by the scope of our experience. For example, we might be able to imagine the passage of a year, but can we imagine the passage of a century? Could we extend our imagination to a span of time measured in thousands of years, a geological era, an eon? Even if our faculty of imagination falls short, we can hypothetically entertain the notion that an eon of time might also be considered a single moment. Whether this happened would depend on how time was measured, and this in turn would depend on the activity of the mind as shaped by knowledge and experience. The limits on our own experience make impossible an awareness that experiences eons as moments, but we can imagine it being so different from us in knowledge or experience that measurements on this scale was wholly natural. Since such a viewpoint is theoretically possible, we are free to work out its implications. Suppose we were to understand the span of time in which human beings have existed as taking up only a single moment. In that case, each event has taken place within this span will have to be understood as inseparable from every other event. We might say that all events are mutually recorded and preserved, equally exhibitions of one another. From this perspective, every unfolding drama through the span of human history can be understood as part of an ongoing manifestation that makes no distinction between past, present and future. In this time without distinction, all events, all shapes and forms, thoughts and emotions, historical happenings are equally available. Though a particular event may not be visible in space here and now, this fact takes on a different significance. The here and now structure no longer specifies a particular moment in time, but rather a variation in a kind of atemporal isness. I think that is modality Tartan Tolkvist pointed here too. Here and now is an exhibition consistent with this circumstance and not with others. 10,000 years ago, one set of circumstances prevailed. 10,000 years from now, a different set of circumstances will operate. But this difference is no longer to be understood as temporal. This thought experiment suggests that the genius of time in presenting the vitality of appearance cannot be confined to the present. Time's creative force emerges within a unity that links experience across past and present and future. By the same token, change cannot be the essence of time. The creative presentational quality of time is bound neither by moment nor that moment, by this moment nor that moment, nor by the transition between the two between the two moments. Past and present and future might be labels that covers a more unitary sense of time. Looking experientially, we might ask, when we identify ourselves as active in the present, are we cutting off the time at a deeper level? No matter what moment we find ourselves in now, we cannot escape time. What is this inescapable time that binds us? If we understand it as accessible through the present moment, we must also acknowledge that this moment is linked to another moment in time, whether past or present, past or future. Such links suggest that the notion of time as unitary is more than simply an interesting hypothesis. Perhaps all time is recorded in each moment of time, with a specific moment shaped in its particulars by the underlying structure of the whole. To say that other specific moments are recorded in this one may hold too tightly to conventional ways of thinking. But if time is not specific moments of time, it must be an entity separate from these moments. Can we make sense of such a possibility? In doing so, what assumptions about the nature of time will we apply? Can these assumptions be further investigated? How great! It's very interesting. I will link a description of this article or document as it is from Scribd in a bit when I upload later on this recording. I say thank you very much and do have a very pleasant day. Bye bye for now.